Welcome to the Tuba Project. Today we're going to talk about how to calculate ED visits from medical claims data. This is part two in our series. Let's dive in. So just a quick review. Last time in part one, we looked at how to identify ED visits in medical claims using code sets, looking at HCPCS codes, revenue center codes, place of service codes. In part two today, we're going to learn how do we merge multiple claims together to define unique visits, because with emergency department visits, most ED visits generate multiple claims, usually at least one institutional and one professional claim, if not more. So we need to merge them together so that when we go to count how many ED visits are happening, we get the right answer. In part three, we're going to further look how to distinguish between different types of ED visits that end in the emergency department, those that continue on to observation, and those that actually end up with admission to the hospital. These are very different things. They're usually measured differently, and we'll dive into how to distinguish them in part three. But let's get into it. So the general approach we're going to take to merge ED claims into encounters is as follows. First, we're going to build the base encounter from institutional claims. And this is really stitching institutional claims together. Most ED visits will only have a single institutional claim. Some will have more than one. In those cases, we have to build an algorithm that stitches those together so we can develop this base encounter and use the start and end dates from across these different claims to create the start and end dates for the overall visit. After we have the base encounter, then we'll assign professional claims to that base encounter. So let's dive into step one, building the base encounter. These are the key fields that we're going to use. And so obviously patient ID is super important. These field names may be slightly different in your claims data, but patient ID intended to represent the unique person in the data set. Maybe it's called member ID in your data set. Another important field is facility NPI. This field isn't always present in claims data sets that we work with. I would say for the most part it is, but oftentimes it'll be missing. And so we'll look at there's different algorithms that we can use if we have it or if we don't. And then there's a bunch of date fields. From a start date standpoint, there's the admission date, the claim start date, and then every line on each claim will have its own start date. And similarly for end dates, there's discharge date for institutional claims, and then claim end and claim line for both institutional and professional claims. And so one of the first things we're going to do is we're going to coalesce these different date fields together so that we can create kind of the start date for the institutional claim that we're going to use to merge and the end date for the institutional claim that we're going to use to merge. And when we look at then combining claims to see if they should be merged, there's 4 different methods that we can possibly use. Basically, there's 2 methods, overlapping and adjacent, but then for each method, we can choose whether or not we require the facility to be the same if we're going to merge the claim. The patient, in order for any 2 claims to be merged, the patient ID must be the same on both claims. That's a given. So in this example we're looking at here, this is an overlap example. And overlap means any date on claim A has to have some overlap with some date on claim B. So in this example, the end date for claim A is February 1st, and the start date for claim B is also February 1st. So that counts as an overlap based on how we're defining overlap. If to take an example of an adjacent claim, adjacent means the 2 claims are not touching. So the end date of claim A in the adjacent example is February 1st. The start date for claim B is February 2nd. These 2 do not touch. So if we were going to use an overlap algorithm, either method A or method B, these claims would not be merged. If we were going to use an adjacent algorithm, method C or method D, these claims would actually be merged. And so in this sense, the overlap algorithms are actually, they're a more strict definition and they will result in fewer claims being merged than the adjacent algorithms, which are less strict. They basically, claims can essentially be further apart and still count to be merged. Why do we allow for this plus or minus one in the adjacent algorithms? There's a lot of different papers that look at this sort of thing, and basically it allows for like variation in the billing process that can occur. Um, and so it's generally like it's generally considered an okay convention to allow for plus or minus 1 day. And sometimes even some papers will use plus or minus 2 days. And we'll see later what the impact of that is when we look at some actual results from Medicare claims. So just a reminder before we see how all this gets merged up, um, and we look at some statistics. Back to part one, this is how we decided to identify ED visits and institutional claims. And so there were two key parts here: the revenue center code portion and the HCPCS code portion. Really, only the revenue center code portion mattered. 99.99% of institutional claims were captured just by the revenue center code logic. And so in the statistics that I'll show you, I'm actually only using the revenue center code logic. I punt on the HCPCS code logic below. On the other hand, the HCPCS code logic is really important for professional claims, and we'll come back to that. So this is a table of some statistics that have been computed from Medicare fee-for-service claims data. It's the Medicare limited data set, the standard analytic files, the 5% sample, same data set we looked at statistics for in part one. And if we look at this, just these two lines at the top, in the data set, there's just about 17 million total unique institutional claims. And of those claims, a little more than 10% of those are actually claims for ED visits using the revenue center code logic 045X and 0981. And then here we look at the four different methods: the overlap with same facility, just overlap, no facility requirement, the adjacent plus or minus 1 day method with the same facility requirement, and the adjacent plus or minus 1 day method with no same facility requirement. And you can see the different results in terms of what we count as when we're building the base encounter. Each row here is essentially the resulting number of encounters. So this column header is actually a little bit misleading. At the top here, the top two rows are unique claims, but these four rows down here, these are actually the unique base encounters that we've built that have resulted from the merging logic. And so a couple interesting things here. One is you can see just by the most strict method A, which results in the least amount of merging. You can see that almost 99.7%, basically the overlap with just counting institutional claims is very close from this method. Versus the bottom method, D, which is the least strict and results in the most amount of merging. There is about a 5% difference when you compare, method D, or I guess 4% difference between method D and method A. So a little bit of a difference there. So how does this algorithm actually work? Wouldn't it be great to actually see the algorithm and learn how it works? Well, turns out the method is the algorithm itself, the SQL algorithm, is fairly complicated, and it'll take a decent amount of work to walk through that. Probably a 15-minute video or so just by itself. And so stay tuned for a deep dive on that next week. But it's a really good algorithm. It's easy to. One of the great things about it is it's not recursive. So it's just like pure SQL, and you can just run it, and it uses very basic SQL run on any data warehouse. This sort of algorithm is like kind of difficult to build in SQL. It's much easier to build these sort of algorithms with like recursion or using loops like in Python. But this approach is like pretty elegant. So it should be, and it's generally useful outside of just the ED visits. But let's dive into the next step, which is, and now that we've decided, built the base encounter from the institutional claims, let's assign professional claims. And so the key fields we're going to use to do that are the date fields from professional claims and again, patient ID. And again, we're going to coalesce claim start date, claim line start into a single kind of professional start date field. Again, this really allows for the fact that like there's a lot of variation in claims data sets. You may not always get claim start date. You may not always get claim line date. So we're just trying to make the most, the best use of the data that you do actually have. And so that's the reason for the coalesce. And we recommend coalescing in the order on the screen here and on the previous slide. So the method that we're going to use to assign professional claims is we're just going to use a simple overlap example. We're not going to use any adjacent plus or minus one sort of stuff here. And so this is actually very simple to understand, very simple to implement in SQL. But there is one complicating factor here, which is, most professional claims should the duration of the claim should just be 1 day, right? The claim start date and the claim end date should be the same day, right? For most professional claims. But if that's not the case, then you run into this problem of, well, based on this simple overlap method, which base encounter should I assign the professional claim to? And this can really create problems. And so the first question is, does this actually happen? Do we see this happen in Medicare claims? And the answer is yes, but not very much, right? So this is all the professional claims in the Medicare claims data set that we're using for all these statistics. And you can see the vast, vast majority of professional claims, professional ED claims, I should say, are just single day. But you do have maybe about some number less than 2,000 here that are multi-day, and you even have one that is over 101 days. And the issue is these, even though it's a small number, they can create duplicates, and it can really create, like a lot of things when duplicates happen, it can really create a lot of duplicates. So a small number of records can blow up into 100,000 or a million of records pretty quickly. And so we need to make sure that these things don't screw up our count. And so we need some sort of a tiebreaker. Now, what I propose here is keep it simple. These claims are like less than 0.01% of the total amount of claims. Could we develop a robust voting algorithm that says, oh, well, which encounter does it overlap more with, or something like that? Yes, of course. The simple thing to do here is to do something like take the minimum of the encounter ID, the base encounter ID that the claim overlaps with. And so whichever encounter ID is smaller, boom, that's the one it gets merged with. So I think that's the solution that I would recommend. So, okay, with that all the way out of the way, let's walk through some results. We've gone through the method, building the base encounter, assigning professional claims. This first method is the most strict method, and it's the method where for institutional, it's basically method A. We require overlap, so adjacent, plus or minus 1 day. We're not doing any of that here, and we require the same facility before we merge to create the base encounter. And then professional, we just look at strict overlap. This results in a little over 1.9 million ED encounters, and you can see the breakdown here. So there's 1.2 million that where there is an institutional base encounter, and then we assigned professional claims, one or more professional claims to that base encounter. There's 469,000 ED visits, ED encounters that are only from institutional, have no professional component. And there's 191,000 ED encounters that are only professional, do not have an institutional component. And we count all of these because the presence of any of these things suggest, even if it's an institutional only, that means there's a 04 5x, a 0981. If it's a professional only, it means there's a 9928x. Either of those things screams ED visit. So even though there's not the presence of both, we're going to count them. But this merging, one of the benefits of the merging is we don't double count the stuff in the middle. And so again, this method is the more strict method. More strict means less merging, which means more ED visits. Method 2, you can see the number goes down a little bit. We're looking at under 1.9 mil total ED visits. This is the method where we're going to use adjacent, so plus or minus 1 day is fine. We're still going to require the same facility. We're still going to require the same professional overlap. And so the professional only component is actually the exact same, but the institutional base numbers change a little bit because that's the part of it that we changed. And in this scenario, again, less strict means more merging, means fewer ED visits. So those things, it's kind of tricky to keep, more strict, less merging, more ED visits. It's kind of like, these things are opposite. But you start to get the hang of it. So finally, remember in part 1, there was a huge discrepancy depending on the method we used to define ED visits and professional claims. We had these two definitions. This really strict or conservative definition that just looked at 9928x, and this much more liberal or less strict definition that looked at 9928x or place of service code equal 23. And there was a massive difference, more than 2x difference in the number of unique claims. So depending, if we have been using this bottom method for all the statistics that we've been looking at in this video, does that mean if we suddenly switch to the top method, we're going to see 100% increase in the number of ED visits? Well, spoiler, the answer is no. So there is a pretty for this we're gonna use method. We're gonna call this method 3, and basically method 3 is method 1, but we're just going to swap out this liberal professional claims definition, and so the institutional counts stay identical to method 1, but the professional count goes up quite a bit. In fact, it goes up by about 50%, a little more than 50% compared to the professional count from method 1. But the end result here is actually only about 5% more total ED visits than method 1, where it's a little more than 2 million total compared to a little over 1.9 million total. So that concludes our kind of walkthrough of how do you merge ED visits into professional claims. Again, this was like a really kind of a conceptual walkthrough. And next week, we're going to dive into the algorithm. So stay tuned.